Okay, so we'll get underway with Dr. Stephen Woodley. We're very privileged indeed to have Dr. Woodley with us. He's an ecologist who's worked in the field of environmental management for 30 years, including in several national parks as Chief Scientist at Parks Canada, as an environmental consultant, and as Director of the Heritage Resources Centre at the University of Waterloo. I told Stephen I wasn't going to go through his CV in detail, but I think one of the most critical contemporary positions that he holds is as Senior Advisor to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN. So we're delighted that you're here, Stephen, and thank you very much for the presentation today.
Good morning. Nice to see you all out after a great evening last night. I want to say thanks to start, because I'm really delighted to be here, and I've really had a good time. Thank you, David. Thank you, Gail, for getting me here. Thank you to my friend Fiona, who's been taking care of me. Thank you so much to the Ghana people for such a warm welcome to country. And thanks to Australia for such a warm welcome to me. You guys are a great bunch. You're nice to work with, and there's enormous similarities between Canada and Australia. It always it astonishes me actually coming here. I'm going to talk today about biodiversity, and I know we've had a lot of talk about parks being for people, and I get that angle completely, and I'm not trying to deny or undermine that argument at all. But I think fundamentally parks have to be about biodiversity. That's what they're for, and if they do a good job about being for biodiversity, then they'll be great for people. And I'll try in my talk to make that connection. So we've got a bit of a challenge on our hands, this wonderful planet that we live on. We have a human footprint problem which is causing biodiversity loss, and we're just started on this path of rapid human-caused climate change. And the two problems are unfortunately deeply interrelated. And I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes basically saying how protected areas can provide what at least the IUCN is calling natural solutions to this combined problem set. We have a good news thing. This huge growth in protected areas in marine world and in the terrestrial world. I was born in 1951, and if you look at the plot on that curve, my birthday was the start of an enormous growth in the protected area estate in the world. I don't think we've ever had anything quite like this in the history of the planet. This kind of growth in a land use. This is a phenomenon. That we have dedicated this much of the planet to conservation. However, the IUCN definition for protected areas says that this real estate that we've set aside is supposed to achieve the long-term conservation of nature. That's its job. And so what can we think about in terms of biology to make sure we're doing this job? Yes, people have to connect to it. Yes, it has to serve people, but its job is to achieve the long-term conservation of nature. And unfortunately, globally, we all know we're not doing a good job with the long-term conservation of nature. This is the Global Biodiversity Outlook 3, and no matter what taxonomic group we look at, we're seeing downward trends. I plotted where Australia was in relationship to Canada and United States and Mexico and the world in terms of what's at risk. So this we can probably ignore vascular plants and fishes because as a group we're not tracking these things very well. But let's go to the bottom and look at mammals, because I always hear that Australia's mammals are in hard shape. So the green is Australia, and as you know, in comparison, you have a problem with conserving your mammals, but not nearly as much as Mexico has a problem conserving their mammals. If you go up to birds, you're actually doing better than Mexico, better than the world average, considerably. If you go up to reptiles, you're doing really well. It's a happy place to be a reptile in Australia, as opposed to Canada, where over 80% of our reptiles have some level of endangerment. So I point this out to say, yes, Australia has a biodiversity problem. And it has a biodiversity problem before you even layer on climate change, because it's just getting ramped up. But your biodiversity problem relative to the rest of the world is not so bad. So you're in a position here for success. If we layer on climate change on this problem, this is a scaled graph, a scaled map done by NASA, where the hotter colors indicate the highest potential change in plant communities. Okay, so the red ones are where you're getting 100% turnover by 2100, 100% turnover of plant communities. So if you look at Canada, the northern latitudes, we're in trouble. I mean, we're going to have completely and absolutely different ecosystems. And somehow we have to think about managing our way through that. But you guys don't, interestingly enough. Yes, you have a climate change problem. I don't want to deny that or belittle that. But relative to the global estate, you have an opportunity for success. You have an opportunity for leadership. Here's an example of the kind of thing we're seeing in Canada. This is a graph of growing season length in Wapusk National Park. It's on the west side of Hudson Bay. And we simply look at, from satellites, when the growing season starts, when the growing season ends, and every gardener can relate to this. Well, in 1985, the growing season was around 90 days long, and now it's 140 days long, since 1985. Dramatic kinds of shifts. We haven't seen shift in species yet because species haven't got there. But that's the level of change that we're seeing in these northern environments. Dramatic. So what possible response spaces do we have to this kind of problem? I would argue that right now, depending on the degrees of change, of temperature change, and depending on our level of knowledge, we have these 4 response states. We can accept what's going on, we can try and manage for it, we can create entirely new ecosystems, people are talking about that, or we can simply flee. And we probably will be fleeing before these changes if we don't know much and we're up in the 4 to 6 degree temperature range. That's likely what's going to happen in northern Canada. I think we're here now. We're in acceptance. We're starting to think about what we're going to do about this, but this is early days. So we're moving towards management. So what would we need from a biological perspective to really move towards management? So the problem is, from a biodiversity perspective, is we're trying to maintain populations in a rapidly changing environment. I believe that's what the problem statement is. And we know from population biology, there's only 4 things that control all populations: birth, death, immigration, and immigration. This is fundamental biology 101, population biology. So our challenge then is, how can we best influence these rates, those rates, to allow the species to best adapt? I don't think anybody thinks we're going to keep the same communities. We're certainly not going to keep the same ecological communities in northern Canada. I doubt you're going to keep the same ecological communities in many parts of Australia. But you should at least keep the parts. We should at least keep the parts so that these communities can reassemble. So the solution to that, and the only solution I know of, I don't see any other option being put on the table, is to maintain large populations. That gives them the best chance to adapt, and connected populations. And if anyone knows any other potential solution to that problem, I would love to hear it. So then what are our options? Well, we can do nothing, and we can adapt only to human needs. And if you look at the UNFCCC, for example, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, most of what we're talking about in adapting to climate change is about human needs. It's about breakwaters and deeper wells and bigger culverts for rainfalls and that kind of stuff. We can do intensive ecosystem management. That would be option 2. And there's several papers and reports and articles on this where, well, we can move species around, we can create mobile reserves. There are actually people seriously proposing we create mobile reserves. And all the people in this room have been involved in reserve creation, and if you think we can create them to be mobile, boy, it's a different world than I've been living in anyway. And we can get into population management, but the cost of doing that will be absolutely enormous. And our ability, I think, our ability to predict where these populations are going to go and how they're going to be successful is very low. So option 3 is basically to create what we're calling a natural solutions approach to provide the best chance for biodiversity, and it will also benefit people. And it's got to be based on what we know of conservation biology, and it's simply a no regrets option. If we create large-scale connectivity, large-scale conservation planning, and 100 years from now, we say, oh, we didn't really need to do that. Will we regret it? Absolutely not. There's no way this is an option we'll regret. If we foreclose on some development options, we can always develop them later. The minerals will still be in the ground. So this has enormous social benefits, and it provides the softest landing. It will not be without its bumps, it will not be without its species loss, but comprehensive landscape planning, connectivity conservation, if you will, is our softest landing, and I think our only reasonable option as a planet to move forward with these giant challenges. It looks like this, but this probably oversimplifies the case. This is a kind of standard thing from literature. Basically, we got to create large-scale conservation networks, which have protected cores, which have connectivity between them, and where they don't exist, we're in the restoration business. Protect, connect, and restore is I think, the model. So here's Australia's protected areas estate, at least as well as the IUCN knows it. This comes from the IUCN World Database on protected areas. You guys have done a great job from a global perspective at setting up protected areas. So is this enough, though, to move towards fighting those great challenges? Is this sufficient? If you look at the distribution, the size class distribution, and this graph is the same everywhere in the world. We have this huge bias towards small protected areas. And small protected areas are great. Small protected areas are great in cities, and they provide great access for people and whatnot. But on their own, they have a lot of problems in conserving biodiversity. We're not going to make it with small protected areas. This is a park I've worked in Canada. It's Point Pelee National Park. It's full of endangered species. It's a tiny little place. It's 12 square kilometers in the very southern part of Canada. And this shows the amphibians that are there historically, and the amphibians that were there in 1972 and then in 1994. We've lost half the amphibians in this park. We've also lost half the reptiles, and we've lost half the fish. Interestingly, we're about 50% on all of these. This is a really well-managed place. It has great people, great biologists, lots of investment, but it's isolated. It's simply too small. And if you apply the rules of conservation biology and look at birth rates, death rates, immigration, and immigration, of which there's no immigration and immigration, the birth and death rates are such that these small populations will go to zero and you'll get to extinction. Basic biology. And unless we can break out of this small park problem we've got globally and move towards connectivity conservation, this is what we'll get, and we won't change those dynamics globally. So our challenge then for the next 40 years is to create a system which is resilient. We know our current system is inadequate. Like it or not, we've got to face up to that problem. It's inadequate in Australia, it's inadequate in Canada. There's very few countries of the world where it is really adequate. So, and the other problem we've got is that as we've created these places, we haven't done it with good conservation science. Conservation science has been out of step with conservation planning. I can't speak for Australia, but I'll guarantee you in Canada it's been completely out of step with conservation planning. So for many of the world's places, we not only have to think about connectivity, but we also have to expand those basic cores that we're going to connect. So that's our challenge. If we're going to provide the softest landing, if we're going to provide what I think is the only option forward, this is our challenge for the next 40 years. So somehow we have to convince people that this is the problem, because they're not convinced now. I think the populations of the planet are busy thinking about other things and are not convinced about this now. This is Biosphere 2. Who's heard of Biosphere 2? It was an American experiment, a fascinating experiment. They took, they greenhoused in about 8 acres of land, and they built what they thought was going to be a successful ecosystem. This is a completely hermetically sealed biosphere, named Biosphere 2 after the Earth, Biosphere 1. And they spent $260 million building this thing, doing the design, et cetera, had a whole bunch of volunteers. 8 people moved in, 1 left because they were sick, so 7 people, and they tried to live within this ecosystem, providing all of the stuff that they needed, recreating the carbon cycle, recreating the water cycle, et cetera, and it failed. It was a spectacular failure. They had to abandon this enterprise. So look at the numbers. The very bottom number, it was 3.14 hectares, which gave them 0.44 hectares per person to live on. So they failed at 0.44 hectares per person. What have we got? There's 7 billion of us on the planet, and if you look at the land surface, we all just have 2.13 hectares. 2.13 hectares is keeping us alive. It's providing all our food. It's creating the carbon cycle, the water cycle. It's doing nutrient cycling. It's pretty astonishing, actually, that we're all being kept alive by our 2.13 hectares of land, and that's added to by 5.16 hectares of water, most of which is relatively unproductive in the open oceans. So somewhere between the Biosphere 2 area and where we are now is the real tipping point of where we're at. And so I think that when we talk about conserving biodiversity, we have to put it in these terms, that they're not just nice things or pretty things. They're things that make the carbon cycle work and the nutrient cycles work. They're the things that keep us alive. And as a community of conservationists, we have to somehow bring that understanding to the public, that the biodiversity is the thing that keeps us alive. And the reason we keep biodiversity in our protected areas and focus on it is because it's fundamental to us, to our very survival. These guys are saying ecosystems, just the sound of it gives me the willies. We have a problem because very few people get the conservation equation globally, and certainly in positions of power, we're just coming up to Rio plus 20, right? 20 years ago we had the Rio Conventions, which spurred a lot of the conservation activity we work on. I'm not sure if the conversation will get to the kind of conversation we need to confront the challenges that are facing us. But on the other hand, there's good news, and I don't want to dwell only on bad news. Here's a bunch of guys in suits, and they're happy as clams. This was in Nagoya a year and a half ago, where they came up with the ACHI targets. And this I think is a huge breakthrough, and it's a huge breakthrough for us all to lever on. The ACHI targets are really, they're a comprehensive set of what we need to do to be successful in conserving biodiversity. Many of the things that we've talked about today or during this conference, if you look at Target 3, that by 2020 countries are supposed to eliminate subsidies harmful to biodiversity. Joshua talked about subsidies in his conversation. It's going to be wonderful if we can get there, if we can really mobilize countries to truly eliminate subsidies. Target 15 says we're going to restore at least 15% of our degraded ecosystems. Well, that's an enormous chit in the bank, if you will. If we can restore 15% of degraded ecosystems and use that to create connectivity conservation, that's an enormous leg up. The one that affects us the most is Target 11. Most people think Target 11 is about moving to 17% of Australia protected or 17% of Canada protected. It's a much deeper and richer target than that. It says that we're going to have 17% of land protected and 10% of water or marine ecosystems as an interim target by 2020, and that we're going to focus on areas that are most important for biodiversity, and they're going to be effectively managed, because that's a huge, not a problem here, but it's a huge problem globally. They're going to be ecologically representative, and they're going to be well-connected system of protected areas. So we've been trying to track Target 11 at the IUCN to see where it's at. This is what our global protected area state looks like. And if you take this map and look at the ecoregions of the world, these are the World Wildlife Fund ecoregions, it looks like this. The pink is still under 10%. So Australia is still, large parts of Australia are still under 10% protection. Big parts of it aren't. Big parts of it over 30% protection. And there's some countries of the world like Brazil who are doing extraordinarily well, really leading the way. Canada, United States, except for Alaska, have enormous amount of work to do here. But we've all signed on to this. We've all signed on to the CBD. Canada, Australia, and 160 other countries. So in terms of protecting ecoregions, here's where we are, and here's where we have to be by 2020. An enormous challenge, but it's something at least we have national commitments to. Here's a list of the Australian ecoregions which are greater than 17% protected, a number of them. Here's a list that are less than 12% protected. So a place to focus, and a place to focus to look at where the biodiversity of Australia is, like the Great Eastern Ranges, for example. We also looked at connectivity, and this is just, think of this as a schematic. How are we going to think about connectivity between protected areas? Well, I basically took the whole protected areas estate in the world, dumped it into a computer, told the computer to reach out and find somebody, find a protected area, and then I came up with an index which looked at what's the gain in connecting protected areas, how far apart are they, and what is the resistance to moving across that space between protected areas. And I used the human footprint map of the Earth. So it comes up with a map like this. This is a map of potential connectivity between protected areas, and you can see it includes the coastal ecoregions. So Australia is in pretty good shape here. You actually have the potential to make connectivity, actually to build these large-scale connectivity networks. So do we in North America. Other places in the world, it's a much greater challenge. To blow up Australia, it looks like this. In terms of the eco-zone connectivity classes, and this is potential connectivity based upon what you have and how difficult it is to connect it up. Enormous opportunity in Australia. If I focus in part of that, which is close to home, let's look at the Mount Lofty Woodlands, which is here. And here's all the protected areas in the Mount Lofty Woodlands. And if you connect them up, even with 5 kilometer buffers, all right, you reach out 5 kilometers, very easy to do. You can build connectivity here without, at least in terms of the global analysis, without too much of a struggle. You're not going to build it in the north part of the ecosystem, or the ecoregion, but certainly in the south, you can. If you reach out with 10 kilometer buffers, you don't get really much gain. So your problem is relatively short and relatively easy in an ecoregion like this. So around the world, let's take a short survey of who's doing what, and I'm going to start with a couple of poor countries. It's always instructive to learn what these folks are doing. This is in Costa Rica. Graham and I were there for a meeting, IUCN meeting last week. Costa Rica has changed their forest cover around. They in the 1980s, they were dramatically losing their forest cover. They've turned that around, and they're starting to recover forest cover restoration in that country. This is a country with that compared to our gross domestic products is way down the list. And they came up with a map. They came up with a map of ecological connectivity for the entire country based upon their protected area systems and connecting their protected area systems, and it looks like this. So they've established a great vision, and they're actually making that vision happen by payments for ecosystem goods and services. Every time you gas up in Costa Rica, a penny a liter goes towards connectivity conservation, and it goes directly to paying landowners because they said what's in it for them, and they pay these kinds of rates. So if the objective is to reforest, they're paying on a 10-year contract $816 a hectare. If they're trying to protect something that's there existing, it's less than that. It's $320 a hectare, etc. But the point is that if a poor country can build connectivity conservation, well, there's a real lesson for us all here in Costa Rica. There's another, and they use biodiversity to show whether or not they've been successful. In this case, the flagship species they're using are green macaw populations. Where they do connectivity, this is in the northern part of the country, they're seeing a biological response, proof of concept, it works. So let's go to the Sumatran lowland rainforest, which has all this phenomenal, at least to me, biodiversity, the kind of the dreams of my childhood, this stuff. And the World Wildlife Fund put out a report that said that all of the lowland rainforest in Sumatra would be gone by 2014. That was the rate that they were losing it. The whole island was in forestry concessions and continues to be in forestry concessions. So a consortium of non-government organizations got together and said, how can we fix this? How can we change this seemingly intractable problem, right? We think we have intractable problems in Canada and Australia. It wasn't even legal to do conservation. All of the land had to go to forestry conservation. So the first thing they did was work with the government to actually change the law. And they got a decree written, not that there wouldn't be forestry leases, but that you could have a forestry lease that was based on ecosystem restoration. So they actually applied for this joint indigenous NGO, Burung Indonesia, Royal Society for the Protection of Birds and BirdLife International. They applied for a forestry lease after they got this changed. And their forestry lease, they don't cut a single tree. They only do restoration, and they fund the restoration on REDD+ money. And they've got a 60-year conservation lease now with a 35-year extension option on it. So there's no logging. They've created 170 community jobs, the jobs that didn't exist there before. In the villages are these wonderful nurseries where where people are growing native trees. They've planted more than 5 million trees in this forestry lease. Illegal logging is way down. And most importantly, all these great creatures are coming back. They've gotten 20 tigers, 20 individual tigers recorded on camera traps in this forestry lease. And more importantly, it's created a whole movement. There's now 8 forestry leases which are going to go to conservation forestry lease in Sumatra. So they've completely, these aren't protected areas under the IUCN definition. I don't see that as a problem. It's great conservation, and it's changed the water on the beans in a seemingly intractable problem. Throughout the Pacific, another area without much money, there's been an enormous growth in locally managed marine protected areas. Great news, great news for conservation, led by First Nations, led by those indigenous communities. If you go to the rich guys, it's actually much less inspiring, although there's some good things happening. If you look, our friends in the US Park Service just came out with this call to action, preparing for their second century. They've committed to 5 geographic regions where they're going to build corridors through voluntary partnerships. It's a good thing. It's a move in the right direction, but I think they can do so much more in that area. If you move to Canada, there's been lots of flag waving, but really not much action. Except from NGOs, actually. That's where the action isn't happening. There currently is an announcement that Canada is going to move to a national conservation plan. We're way behind you guys in connectivity conservation. And there's parliamentary hearings going on for what a national conservation will mean, plan will mean. In the meantime, this is a map of the protected area in Canada, and the pink bits, which don't come out that well, are places where large-scale connectivity conservation is being planned. Most of it, like Yellowstone to Yukon, is being done by NGOs. There is some interesting initiatives in northern Ontario and northern Quebec, which are really, call them biodiversity offsets, because it's really a license to develop mining and hydroelectric potential in those northern ecosystems, but they'll probably be 50% protected. Some of the most interesting stuff in Canada, and again, the great parallels, are led by First Nations. Now, this is the Decho First Nations land use plan. It's the most interesting, comprehensive, conservation-based land use plan I know anywhere, and the scale of it is huge. Right over here is the new Nahanni National Park. It's 4 million hectares, and that's just a corner of their whole conservation plan for their homelands. We did a great celebration when Nahanni was made, but it wouldn't have been made without the Decho First Nations. These people live off-grid, off-road. But they're inspired conservationists. The model we've been pushing in Canada, and I think the dynamics are the same everywhere, really. It's protect. We need sufficient conservation corps. We need connections between them, and we should use our restoration credits to build those things where they don't exist. And we should also track. We need to know if we're being successful at building these things. I can't say enough about what you guys are doing down here. I think it's absolutely impressive, and I think that you have the potential to be real world leaders, real leaders with the kind of conservation planning that you're thinking through. It's early days, but things like the Great Eastern Ranges initiative are truly inspiring, and I'll tell you they're inspiring the world. So good on you. Not only are you working to do it on the ground, but my friend Graham Warboys and others are providing intellectual leadership by books like this. And this book is read everywhere. It's right around the world. People are using this kind of guidance, which comes out of Australia for connectivity conservation. The tools, Josh went over the tools, so I took all my tool slides out. The tools are there, as he pointed out very, very eloquently, in private land stewardship, conservation easements, payments for ecosystem goods and services, biodiversity offsets. I think we should use them all in building that kind of a system. Thanks. The impact of climate change is it's messy. There's no question about it. The warmer it gets, the bigger problems we get, and people get really hurt. If you look at the potential impacts in places like Africa, we're seeing a 50% reduction in yield from rain-fed agriculture by 2020 in Africa. These problems are absolutely an enormous scale, and if we don't use ecosystems to solve some of these problems, so-called ecosystem-based adaptation, with its inherent biodiversity gains, we will completely miss the boat. The data on the value of ecosystems to fight climate change is all there. Not only do they mitigate, because they conserve carbon in natural ecosystems, but they're also important for ecosystem-based adaptation. You guys all know this, but we have to take these arguments and make them public arguments. I guess I agree with the line that we're not going to win the argument if we only base the conservation argument on biodiversity. It's got to be based on carbon, like protecting, that forests protect 50% of terrestrial carbon on the earth, that deforestation contributes 1.6 billion tons of carbon to year into the atmosphere, that peatlands are fundamental. We just can't develop any peatlands anywhere. We've got to make the argument based on water supply. Almost a third of our cities depend on protected areas for their domestic water around the world, a third of our cities. You see ecosystem-based adaptation now in all the big conventions, through the World Bank, the GEF. This is what we're talking about. We haven't inserted ourselves well enough into the ecosystem-based adaptation argument as a protected area community. We have a huge opportunity to do that, because this is where the money is going to be. And the international development money is going to be on ecosystem-based adaptation. There's already success stories to build on. If you look at the Amazon region, they're leading the way. Another country which is not a rich country, they're leading the way in terms of showing us how it's done with conservation and connectivity conservation. The IUCN it's packaged this approach that I've just been talking about in a document called Natural Solutions. So that's why I titled my talk Natural Solutions. You can get this online if you're interested, and this is what we're going to be pushing for, and this will be a key theme at the World Parks Congress, which will, inshallah, be in Sydney in 2014. So we can really get into dealing with these issues then. So to summarize, I think we need to I didn't like the political panel's answer to the question of are we losing kind of political capital as a community, the protected area community. I thought they skated around the answers, frankly. I think we are losing ground, and I think we need to rebrand protected areas as really new solutions. And I think they are new solutions. If you look at the IUCN Class 1 to 6, there's an enormous range of opportunities for what can happen under the name protected area. There's an enormous range of protected area governance types, including indigenous and community conserved areas. We've got to push for these other values like carbon and watersheds and flood control and protecting food relatives. We've got to mainstream protected areas into climate change, but I guess that we can't do it at the expense of forgetting about biodiversity, because ultimately it's all about biodiversity. because we're doing this and we're making these arguments so we ultimately we can protect biodiversity, because it's the very stuff that's going to keep us alive. I don't know how much biodiversity we can lose and affect major ecosystem processes on the world. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. But the safe position is to not lose any. We will lose some, but we should be aiming for the safe position. And I guess my message to you guys, and I'm so impressed with what's going on in this country, that you can be, and indeed you must be, a world leader in connectivity conservation. Thanks very much.
Stephen, thank you very much. And there is time for a couple of questions, so I'm sure there'll be plenty. Yes, right in front of you, David.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. That was fantastic. The heart for me, part of my job and Parks Forum's job is around taking up the questions of how we communicate these issues. You went to some of the key parts of that at the end of your presentation. You threw out a lot of stats associated with climate change. It seems that the conversation around climate change in Australia is a toxic conversation at the moment, and I wonder whether or not there are times that I've seen in my career, for example, once worked in the disability movement, and when certain terminology would be adopted from a rights-based perspective, but then it would start being bandied around and the meaning of that terminology would somehow be lost. People would take up new terminology in order to try and take the same background conversation forward, and I wondered whether or not you see the ecosystem-based adaptation conversation as being another way to communicate to people who don't understand the climate change conversation.
I guess it frustrates us all that the conversation, whatever conversations we've been in for our careers, keep changing because people keep relabeling. That happens all the time. And yes, I think ecosystem-based adaptation is probably a better entry point to the discussion than worrying about climate change, because climate change can just be all bad news, and it is pretty bad news, frankly. And people turn off because they want positive solutions, not problems. You know, don't bring me problems, Woodley, bring me solutions, was what my first manager told me. And ecosystem-based adaptation is a solution. And if we bring it to the table and bring natural solutions, that's why we tried to put a positive spin on this, that protected areas are natural solutions to these problems. They're good news. They're the return on investment for natural solutions is a great return on investment, better than anything else, in fact. And I completely agree. That's where we've got to go with the argument.
One more?
This guy right there.
Yes, thank you. There's a microphone coming your way.
G'day. I was just wondering what or who is driving the change in your Amazons and your Costa Ricas, and then what's preventing us in more developed or richer countries? Is there blockers, or how do we get that drive as well?
I think part of it is the large NGO community is pretty creative, and it's easier for their creativity to become unleashed in those countries. That's part of the solution, and they don't operate as much, and it's a little, maybe the system is more brittle here, and in places like Canada. But there's so much energy and there's so much talent in this room. I mean, we should be able to unblock those things. If they can do it in Costa Rica, why can't we do it here? I mean, it's an increasingly hard debate. The polarization between left and right, as we've heard from politicians who know far more about this than I do, is increasing in our countries. Somehow we've got to make conservation not a political issue. It's really a survival and human well-being issue.
Stephen, I'm sure we could go on for much longer, but thank you very much indeed for the presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank Stephen very much.